Karoline Levitt stood at the podium, maintaining her composure as the press briefing came to a close. The atmosphere in the room was routine, with reporters scribbling notes and adjusting their recorders, preparing to wrap up. Just as Karoline was about to step away, a voice sliced through the murmurs, sharp and loaded with condescension. "Miss Levitt," the reporter called out, his tone laced with doubt and a hint of smugness, "don't you think that at just 27 years old, you're a little inexperienced for a role of this magnitude? With all due respect, isn't this a seat better suited for someone with more years under their belt? Someone the American people can rely on?" The question hung in the air, its weight pressing down on the room, silencing even the quietest whispers. Heads turned toward the reporter, a young man with a thick notepad and an air of self-assured certainty. His smirk widened slightly as he tapped his pen against the desk, waiting for Karoline's response, relishing the tension he had just created. For a fleeting moment, her calm facade flickered, just enough for those closest to notice, but just as quickly, she mastered herself, her lips pressing into a polite yet firm smile. She did not rush to respond, letting the silence stretch, forcing the weight of the question to linger. The tension grew thicker, suffocating almost, as the press waited for her reaction. It wasn't the first time a young professional had been challenged for their age rather than their qualifications, but the moment felt deliberate, an attempt to undermine her authority rather than engage in meaningful discourse. The reporter's question was not about policy, not about her competency, but about whether her age alone disqualified her from leading. It was a tactic as old as politics itself: question the legitimacy of a person not based on merit, but on optics. The moment, subtle as it was, reflected a broader narrative that often plagued ambitious young leaders: the presumption that experience is measured in years rather than accomplishments. Karoline had spent years proving herself, climbing the political ranks through dedication, intelligence, and sheer perseverance. She had faced scrutiny before, but this was different. It was public, calculated, and designed to put her on the defensive. The reporter's expression made it clear he anticipated a flustered response, perhaps a justification, or even worse, an admission of uncertainty. But Karoline understood that how she answered would shape perceptions far beyond this room. She had seen seasoned politicians stumble over simpler questions, and she knew that addressing this moment with anything less than unwavering confidence would play into the very doubts he was trying to sow. The room remained eerily still, journalists leaning forward in anticipation, some intrigued, others merely waiting for a misstep to document. And yet Karoline did not flinch, nor did she offer an immediate rebuttal. Instead, she let the weight of the silence do the work for her. The smirk on the reporter's face began to wane, his certainty starting to chip away as he realized he had not provoked the immediate reaction he had expected. The air in the room crackled with suspense. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, a voice, familiar and unmistakable, cut through the quiet. "Is that what we're doing now?" The words carried across the room, firm and laced with disbelief. It was Donald Trump, leaning into the microphone, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and incredulity. In that instant, the entire room shifted. The battle had begun, but Karoline was no longer standing alone. Donald Trump's voice broke the tension in the room, his tone carrying a mix of disbelief and amusement as he leaned into the microphone. "Is that what we're doing now?" he asked, his gaze sweeping across the sea of reporters. "We're questioning people because they're young? Really? That's where we're at?" His voice was firm, dismissive, and laced with the kind of certainty that commanded attention. The room collectively shifted, all eyes snapping toward him as the weight of his words settled over them. The reporter who had posed the question to Karoline Levitt stiffened but held his ground, clearly emboldened by the confrontation he had sparked. "Well, Mr. President," the reporter pressed, attempting to regain control of the moment, "it's a valid question. Experience is important. Surely you agree that someone with more years in politics might be better suited for a role of this magnitude?" Trump's expression darkened, and with a slight shake of his head, he raised a hand, cutting the reporter off mid-sentence. "Stop right there," he said, his voice firm, unimpressed. "First of all, it's not a valid question. It's a lazy question, and I've heard enough lazy questions in my time to recognize one when I see it." A ripple of chuckles spread across the room, momentarily breaking the tension, though the edge of confrontation remained thick in the air. Trump wasn't finished. His tone sharpened, his words gaining momentum as he leaned forward. Second of all, don't pretend you're concerned about experience. You're not concerned about experience. You're concerned about her being someone you can't predict, someone you can't control. The reporter blinked, momentarily stunned by the directness of Trump's accusation, but Trump pressed on, relentless. You know what's funny? He said, gesturing toward the reporter with a casual flick of his hand. You never ask the people who've been in Washington for 20, 30, 40 years, decades, collecting dust and doing nothing for the American people about their experience, do you? You never wonder if their fancy suits and endless committees have qualified them for anything. No, you're perfectly fine with them sitting there forever, talking and talking, never getting anything done. The words hung heavy in the air, and for a brief moment there was an unspoken acknowledgement among some of the reporters. Trump was a polarizing figure, but there was an undeniable truth in what he was saying. The political landscape had been filled with career politicians who had spent decades making promises only to leave behind a legacy of stagnation and bureaucracy. And here's the ironic part, Trump continued, his voice lowering slightly, forcing the room to lean in. People like Karoline Leavitt, they're exactly what this country needs. He gestured toward her briefly, though she remained silent, her face carefully neutral. She's young? Yeah, you got that part right. Big deal. She's also sharp. She's driven. She's not bogged down by the swamp. She's brought more ideas and actual results to the table than most of the so-called experienced people you're busy writing love letters to. The sharp jab sent a murmur through the room, a mix of amusement and unease. Trump turned slightly toward Karoline, his expression almost bemused. Karoline here, she's 27, and I say that's an advantage. You know why? Because she's not part of the old boys club. She hasn't spent decades making backroom deals and selling out the American people. She's done more by this age than most people do in their lifetime. Trump's tone deepened, and now his full attention was back on the reporter. But you, he said, voice firm, unyielding. You sit there, acting like age is the only thing that matters. Why? Because she's not your idea of a politician? His voice grew louder, more direct, as he stared the reporter down. Do you even know what you're doing when you ask questions like that? It's not journalism. It's not reporting on the truth. It's bias, plain and simple. You don't like that she doesn't fit your narrative, so you throw out the age card. Creative, very creative. The reporter opened his mouth to push back, but Trump raised a single finger, effortlessly silencing him. No, don't even try it, he warned. I've heard this nonsense for years. You don't respect the voters who chose her, who believe in her. You don't even respect her. All you want to do is tear her down because she's not the kind of politician you're used to. Well, guess what? That's exactly why she's sitting here, and you're the one asking cheap questions. A ripple of murmurs spread through the press pool, and a few reporters even clapped before catching themselves. Karoline, still silent, felt a faint smile pull at her lips. It wasn't often that someone spoke with such passion in her defense. Trump, however, wasn't done. You say age matters? He challenged, now pointing directly at the reporter. Now, look at history. Some of the greatest leaders we've ever had were young when they started. Alexander the Great? He started his conquest at 20 years old. Teddy Roosevelt? Do you know what he was doing in his 20s? Reforming, changing the system. And here's Karoline, doing the same thing, driving change, stepping into the fire every day, while people like you sit back and doubt her. His gaze never wavered. And you know why you doubt her? He didn't wait for an answer. Because she's not part of that tired, broken machine you've been protecting for years. The reporter made one last attempt to interject, his voice now noticeably shakier. But, Mr. President, we can't compare modern politics to— Sure we can, Trump interjected sharply, not allowing the excuse to form. You're trying to push the idea that only seasoned politicians can do the job. Seasoned politicians, he snorted, shaking his head. Like the ones who've brought us debt, wars, and broken promises? If you're asking me whether I'll take Karoline's ideas and determination over their so-called experience, the answer is yes, 1,000 times yes. The room erupted with a mix of laughter and applause. The tension that had once suffocated the space was now replaced with an undeniable energy. Karoline felt her heartbeat steady, the earlier apprehension replaced with a strange lightness. Trump hadn't just defended her qualifications, he had redefined what it meant to lead. He let the moment settle before speaking again, his voice carrying finality. "Here's the deal," he said, sweeping his gaze across the room, making sure every journalist heard him. "Karoline is exactly what this country needs. Someone new, someone fresh, someone who has the courage to stand up even when the deck is stacked against her. You don't like it? Tough, get used to it. Because that's how movements start, that's how change happens." He leaned back slightly, the faintest of grins tugging at his lips. "And if you're not ready for that, maybe it's not Karoline who's out of touch." The energy in the room buzzed with unspoken acknowledgement. The reporter sat frozen, his smirk wiped clean. Karoline caught Trump's eye and gave him a small nod, a subtle gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes. Donald Trump's words had shifted the entire tone of the press briefing, transforming what had started as a condescending question about Karoline Leavitt's age into a much broader debate about experience, leadership, and the very nature of political credibility. The reporter, who had confidently raised the question, now seemed caught between frustration and unease, while the rest of the room absorbed the weight of Trump's response. It wasn't just about Karoline anymore. It was about the long-standing perception that experience in politics was tied solely to the number of years someone had spent in office, rather than their actual accomplishments. Trump had challenged this notion head-on, exposing what many had come to accept as an unspoken truth. Washington was filled with career politicians who had spent decades in power, yet had little to show for it. And yet the media never seemed to question whether their experience had translated into effective leadership. Instead, they reserved their scrutiny for fresh faces, particularly those who posed a challenge to the status quo. The assumption behind the reporter's question was clear. Experience, measured in years, was the defining factor of competence. But history had proven time and again that age was not necessarily an indicator of ability, vision, or effectiveness. Some of the greatest leaders the world had ever seen had risen to power at a young age, bringing with them new perspectives, bold ideas, and a willingness to disrupt outdated systems. Alexander the Great had begun his legendary conquests at the age of 20, proving that leadership was about strategic thinking and decisiveness, not the accumulation of years. Theodore Roosevelt, a man often revered for his impact on American politics, had been a force for change in his 20s, already making waves as a reformer before eventually becoming the youngest U.S. president in history. The idea that only those who had spent decades in politics could be trusted to lead was not only flawed but also dangerous, as it discouraged innovation, fresh perspectives, and much-needed reforms. Trump's defense of Karoline was not just about her. It was about rejecting the notion that leadership belonged exclusively to those who had spent their lives in the political machine. "You never ask these questions of people who have been in Washington forever, do you?" he had pointed out, and the truth of that statement lingered in the air. There were politicians who had sat in Congress for 30 or 40 years, collecting salaries, attending endless committee meetings, and making lofty promises, yet they had done little to improve the lives of everyday Americans. Their experience had not translated into meaningful action. Instead, it had often made them complacent, more focused on maintaining their positions than enacting real change. And yet, the press rarely challenged them on whether their decades in office had produced results. They were given a pass, their experience serving as an impenetrable shield against scrutiny. Karoline, on the other hand, represented something different. She was young, unburdened by the political baggage that weighed down so many in Washington, and most importantly, she was results-driven. Her rise was not a product of privilege or backroom deals, but of merit, intelligence, and hard work. And yet, instead of being recognized for her accomplishments, she was being questioned simply because she did not fit the traditional mold. This was not just about her qualifications, it was about control. As Trump had pointed out, the reporter's real concern was not whether Karoline was capable, but whether she was predictable, whether she could be molded into the kind of politician they were used to covering. The media, after all, had a vested interest in maintaining a political landscape that was familiar and easy to navigate. A young, independent-minded leader posed a threat to that because she was not tied to the same old power structures and alliances that kept Washington stagnant. The debate over experience versus effectiveness was one that extended far beyond Karoline's case. Across industries, it had been proven that fresh perspectives often led to the most groundbreaking innovations. In business, technology, and science, some of the most transformative ideas had come from young minds who had not yet been conditioned to accept the limitations of the past. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk had revolutionized their fields before they had even reached middle age, not because they had spent decades slowly climbing the ranks, but because they had been willing to challenge conventional wisdom and think differently. The same principle applied to politics. Experience, when it meant understanding governance, strategy, and diplomacy, could be valuable, but when it simply meant years of existing within a broken system, it was not an asset, it was a liability. Karoline, like many young leaders before her, represented an opportunity for change, and that was precisely why she was being challenged. If she had been another establishment politician with a long but unremarkable track record, no one would have raised a question about her experience. The real issue was that she represented something new, and newness in politics often invited resistance. The irony, as Trump had pointed out, was that many of the politicians who had supposedly earned their positions through experience had done little to justify their continued presence in office. The American people had seen firsthand what decades of traditional political experience had produced: runaway debt, endless wars, bureaucratic inefficiency, and a government that often seemed out of touch with the very citizens it was meant to serve. The contrast between experience and leadership was stark, and Trump had made it clear where he stood. Leadership was not about how many years someone had spent in Washington. It was about vision, results, and the courage to challenge a system that no longer served the people. Karoline embodied those qualities, and for that reason alone, she was more qualified than most. Trump's words had not just silenced the reporter. They had reframed the entire discussion. The question was no longer whether Karoline was too young for the role. It was whether the American people were ready to accept that true leadership had nothing to do with age and everything to do with action. As the room absorbed the weight of the exchange, Karoline remained poised, her expression calm but resolute. She had always known that her age would be a talking point, but what mattered now was that the conversation had shifted. No longer was she merely defending her right to be in the room. She was standing as a symbol of a much larger fight, one that challenged the very way leadership was defined. And in that moment, with the press still murmuring and the weight of Trump's words hanging in the air, it became clear that this was not just about her qualifications. It was about a movement, about a new era of leadership that was no longer willing to wait its turn. Experience, after all, was not about time, it was about impact. And Karoline, despite her age, was already proving that she had more of it than most. Throughout history, young leaders have emerged as some of the most influential figures in shaping the world, proving that leadership is not defined by age, but by vision, courage, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. Donald Trump's defense of Karoline Leavitt was not just about her as an individual, but about a broader argument: the idea that young leaders are not a liability to governance, but an asset. The notion that only those who have spent decades in politics are qualified to lead is not only outdated but fundamentally flawed. Some of the greatest transformations in history have been driven by individuals who refuse to accept the limits imposed by their youth. Alexander the Great, who began his legendary conquests at just 20 years old, understood that leadership was about decisiveness, intelligence, and the ability to inspire. He built one of the largest empires in history, not because of experience measured in years, but because of his ability to act with precision and vision. Similarly, Theodore Roosevelt, often remembered as one of the most dynamic and reformist presidents in American history, was already making waves in politics in his 20s, challenging corruption and pushing forward progressive policies long before he took the presidency at just 42. Trump's argument that Karoline's age was an advantage rather than a weakness struck at the heart of a long-standing political bias, one that assumes wisdom comes only with years spent in the system. In reality, experience in politics often equates to entrenchment within bureaucratic inefficiencies, backroom deals, and a resistance to change. Many career politicians have spent decades in Washington, yet their long tenure has not translated into effective governance. Instead, their experience often manifests as an ability to navigate the political machine rather than challenge it. This is precisely why young leaders like Karoline are so crucial. They bring fresh perspectives, untainted by decades of compromises and political maneuvering. They approach problems with new energy, innovative thinking, and a focus on results rather than optics. They have not yet been conditioned to accept dysfunction as an inevitable part of the system. Karoline represents a shift in American politics, one that many in the media and the political establishment find uncomfortable. The old guard thrives on predictability, on politicians who have been in the game long enough to understand the unwritten rules and to play by them. A young leader, especially one who is bold and independent, disrupts this balance. Trump's comment that the reporter's real concern was not Karoline's experience, but the fact that she was someone they could not control, was telling. It was not just an offhand remark, it was a fundamental truth about the nature of politics. The system is designed to perpetuate itself, to reward longevity rather than effectiveness, and to create barriers for those who seek to change it from the outside. This is why young leaders are so often dismissed before they are even given a chance to prove themselves. Yet history shows that true change has always come from those who are willing to break away from the norm. The founding fathers of the United States were, by today's political standards, young men when they crafted the foundation of the nation. James Madison, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, was only 36 when the Constitution was drafted. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence at 33. These were not seasoned politicians with decades of experience behind them. They were visionaries who saw the flaws in the existing system and had the courage to build something better. If today's political climate had been applied to them, they too would have been dismissed for their lack of experience. The private sector, too, has shown time and again that innovation is often led by the young. The greatest advancements in technology, business, and science have come from individuals who had the audacity to think differently and the energy to pursue groundbreaking ideas. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates revolutionized technology before they were 30. Elon Musk, long before becoming a household name, was already pushing the boundaries of space exploration and electric vehicles in his 20s and 30s. These individuals did not wait to be deemed experienced enough before making an impact. They saw opportunities, took risks, and changed the world. So why should politics be any different? The idea that governance should be left only to those who have spent decades in the system is not just misguided, it is dangerous. It creates a cycle where the same problems persist because they are being handled by the same people using the same outdated approaches. If the goal of leadership is to solve problems and serve the people, then the most important qualities should be intelligence, adaptability, and a results-driven mindset, not just the number of years someone has spent in office. Karoline Leavitt embodies these qualities, and that is precisely why she is facing such scrutiny. Her youth is not a weakness, it is her greatest strength. Trump's closing remarks about movements and change were not just rhetoric. They were a reminder of how progress happens. Every great shift in history has been driven by those who were willing to challenge the old ways and bring in new ideas. Those who resisted them always used the same arguments, that they were too young, too inexperienced, too unconventional. But time and time again, history has proven that it is precisely those people who make the biggest impact. Karoline Leavitt, like the many young leaders before her, is not just stepping into a role, she is redefining what it means to lead. The question is not whether she is too young for politics. The question is whether the political establishment is ready for the kind of leadership she represents. The confrontation between Donald Trump and the reporter had exposed more than just a bias against Karoline Leavitt's age. It had revealed a deeper, more systemic issue within the media: selective scrutiny based on narrative control. The question posed to Karoline was never really about experience. It was about creating doubt, about reinforcing the idea that someone outside the establishment, someone young and ambitious, could not be trusted with leadership. This moment was a perfect illustration of how the media selectively applies its standards, holding certain figures under a microscope while allowing others to pass without question. Trump had immediately identified the double standard at play, calling it out with the kind of bluntness that made many in the room uncomfortable. "You never ask the people who've been in Washington for 30 or 40 years, collecting dust and doing nothing about their experience," he had said, and the truth of that statement lingered in the air. The media, which often claimed to champion fairness and objectivity, had developed a habit of directing its toughest scrutiny not at the entrenched, ineffective politicians who had spent decades making empty promises, but at those who threatened the status quo. Karoline Leavitt was a prime example of this pattern. Instead of being questioned about her policies, her vision, or her accomplishments, she was being reduced to her age. This was not an isolated instance, but rather part of a broader trend in political journalism, one in which certain figures, particularly outsiders, were framed as unqualified or dangerous, not because of their actual abilities, but because they disrupted the expected political narrative. The media had, time and again, demonstrated its ability to shape public perception not through outright falsehoods, but through selective coverage, omission, and emphasis on certain narratives over others. The fact that a young leader like Karoline was being subjected to scrutiny over her age, while career politicians with decades of failures were rarely questioned about their effectiveness, was a testament to this imbalance. Trump had not just defended Karoline, he had exposed the hypocrisy that many Americans had grown weary of. It was a tactic often seen in political journalism, raising superficial concerns to cast doubt while avoiding substantive discussions about results. The media rarely applied the same standard of experience to those who had spent their lives in politics with little to show for it. If experience was truly the benchmark for leadership, then why had so many seasoned politicians led the country into debt, endless wars, and bureaucratic gridlock? Why were they not held accountable for their failures in the same way young leaders were preemptively discredited for their potential? The answer was clear: because experience, in the way the media used it, was often not a genuine measure of competency, but a convenient weapon to wield against those who didn't fit their preferred mold. The bias wasn't just about age, it was about control. Young, independent-minded politicians posed a challenge to the establishment, and the media, as a key player in shaping public discourse, played a role in maintaining that establishment's grip. When journalists questioned young leaders like Karoline, it was not necessarily out of genuine concern, but out of an effort to reinforce the traditional power structures that they were comfortable reporting on. A new wave of leadership meant unpredictability, and unpredictability was something the media struggled to control. Trump had pointed this out with razor-sharp clarity. "You're not concerned about experience. You're concerned about her being someone you can't predict, someone you can't control." And that was the heart of the issue. The press preferred politicians who fit into their pre-established narratives, who played by the rules, and who operated within the boundaries of acceptable discourse. The irony was that while the media often prided itself on holding power accountable, it frequently failed to apply that principle evenly. Instead of questioning why seasoned politicians had allowed problems to fester for decades, they focused their scrutiny on newcomers who hadn't yet had the chance to fail. The underlying message was clear: change was suspect, and those who represented it would face an uphill battle not just against the political establishment, but against the media that helped sustain it. Karoline Leavitt's confrontation with a reporter was not just a defense of her qualifications, but an exposure of a larger issue: how the media selectively applies its scrutiny, reinforcing existing power structures rather than challenging them. Trump had made it abundantly clear: the problem was not that Karoline lacked experience, but that she lacked the kind of experience that made her easy to control. And for that reason, she, like many other young leaders before her, would continue to face an uphill battle against a media landscape that often prioritized narrative over truth. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, Karoline Leavitt sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. Trump had not only defended her, he had reframed the entire conversation, turning what was meant to be a moment of doubt into a declaration of strength. She had entered the press briefing expecting scrutiny, knowing that her age would be a focal point, but she had not anticipated such an unapologetic and public endorsement from the former president. The impact of his words was undeniable. He had not just pushed back against a single reporter's condescending question. He had dismantled the entire premise that youth equated to incompetence. He had done more than defend her. He had positioned her as a symbol of the very change Washington needed, and in doing so, he had shifted the spotlight onto the hypocrisy of an establishment that protected its own while questioning the legitimacy of those who dared to challenge it. Karoline could feel the eyes of the press lingering on her, watching for her reaction, waiting to see if she would fumble under the weight of the moment. But she remained composed, her expression calm, though beneath the surface her mind raced. She understood the significance of what had just happened. Trump's words had not only validated her presence in the political arena, but had sent a clear message that she was not alone in this fight. She had worked tirelessly to get to where she was, and while she had faced obstacles and skepticism along the way, she had never allowed them to define her. Now, for the first time in a public setting of this scale, someone had articulated the very thoughts she had kept to herself. That experience, as it was traditionally defined, was not the ultimate measure of a leader's worth. That what mattered more was the ability to act, to lead with conviction, and to challenge a system that had grown stagnant. Trump's final words echoed in her mind. "You don't need me to fight for you, you know," he had said, almost teasingly, yet there was an unmistakable undertone of respect in his voice. It was a rare moment of acknowledgement, a recognition that she was more than capable of holding her own, but that, in this particular, the press briefing had started as just another routine exchange, but it had ended as something far more significant. The murmurs in the room made it clear that Trump's words had struck a chord, not just with his supporters, but with those who understood the deeper implications of the conversation. A few reporters had even nodded along, perhaps realizing the truth in what had been said, that Washington was full of experienced politicians who had accomplished little, while people like Karoline, who had the passion and drive to create real change, were being forced to justify their right to lead. She had always known that she would have to fight for credibility, that she would have to work twice as hard to prove herself. But now she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just defending her own qualifications. She was standing for something much bigger. As the press briefing wrapped up, Karoline found herself looking at Trump once more, silently acknowledging what had just transpired between them. He had spoken with the force and confidence of someone who had spent years navigating the battlefield of public scrutiny, and she had no doubt that his words would reverberate far beyond this room. But at the heart of it all, what mattered most was the simple truth he had exposed. Leadership is not about age, it is about action, and she was ready to prove that she belonged. The aftermath of the exchange between Donald Trump and the reporter lingered in the air, its impact rippling beyond the confines of the press briefing room. What had begun as a routine media interaction had transformed into a larger conversation about leadership, experience, and the biases that often shape public perception. The reporter who had smugly posed the question to Karoline Leavitt now sat noticeably quieter, his earlier confidence replaced by the stark realization that he had miscalculated. His attempt to cast doubt on Karoline's credibility had backfired, not just because Trump had forcefully dismantled the premise of his question, but because the argument itself had been exposed as fundamentally flawed. As Trump had pointed out, experience, at least as it had traditionally been defined, was not an automatic qualification for effective leadership. Washington was filled with career politicians who had spent decades in office yet had accomplished little of substance. Meanwhile, figures like Karoline represented a new wave of leadership, one driven by action rather than longevity. That reality had been laid bare for all to see, and while the reporter may have expected to catch Karoline off guard, it was his own narrative that had been shattered instead. As murmurs of conversation spread throughout the room, it was clear that Trump's words had resonated. Even among those who often viewed him with skepticism, there was an undeniable truth to what he had said. A few reporters exchanged knowing glances, perhaps acknowledging the double standard that had just been called out. Some even nodded subtly in agreement, recognizing that the line of questioning Karoline had faced was part of a broader pattern, one that sought to undermine young, non-traditional leaders rather than assess them on merit. The room was no longer just reacting to Trump's remarks, it was reflecting on them. And that shift in perspective was significant. It meant that, for at least a moment, the conversation had moved beyond partisanship and into the realm of something deeper, the realization that leadership should be measured by results, not by the number of years someone had spent playing the political game. For Karoline, the moment was both a challenge and an opportunity. While she had remained poised throughout the exchange, she understood that this confrontation would follow her beyond the walls of the briefing room. It would spark debates on news segments, become the subject of political commentary, and likely even influence public opinion. Some would argue that she had been unfairly targeted, while others would double down on the belief that she was too young for the role she held. But regardless of how the narrative unfolded, one thing was certain. She had been thrust into the spotlight in a way that forced people to consider a different perspective. Trump had not just defended her, he had shifted the terms of the debate. No longer was the focus solely on whether she was experienced enough. Now people were asking a different question. Why was experience being defined in a way that excluded those who were actually willing to create change? And that shift, more than anything, ensured that this moment would not be easily forgotten. The exchange between Donald Trump and the reporter serves as a powerful reminder that leadership is not defined by age but by action, courage, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. For older generations who have witnessed decades of political promises and policies that often fail to deliver, this moment underscores a valuable lesson. Experience. Meanwhile, fresh voices, unburdened by the political machine, bring new energy and ideas that have the potential to create real change. This lesson is not limited to politics. It applies to all areas of life. The notion that younger generations should wait their turn or earn their place through time alone is flawed. What matters is capability, determination, and results. Seniors who have spent their lives working hard, building families, and navigating the challenges of an ever-changing world understand that progress is not about simply existing in a role for a long time. It is about what one does with the time they have. At the same time, this moment also highlights the importance of standing up for those who face unfair scrutiny. Many seniors have been mentors, parents, or community leaders who have guided younger generations, recognizing potential and supporting those who dare to step forward. Just as Trump defended Karoline against an unfair challenge, we all have opportunities in life to uplift and encourage those who are breaking barriers, whether in politics, business, or our own community. Believing in the next generation does not mean dismissing experience. Rather, it means recognizing that wisdom is not exclusive to any one age group. Young leaders bring innovation, while older generations offer perspective and guidance. Both are essential for progress. Moreover, this exchange is a testament to the power of confidence and self-belief. Karoline remained composed in the face of doubt, proving that strength is not just about having experience, but about having conviction. Many seniors have faced moments in life where they were underestimated or dismissed, whether in their careers, their families, or society at large. Yet resilience and self-assurance have always been key to overcoming obstacles. This story serves as a reminder that, no matter one's age, standing firm in one's abilities and refusing to be defined by others' expectations is the path to making a real impact. Whether we are young or old, what truly matters is not how long we have been around, but what we choose to do with our time and influence.